You're tuned in to the Stingbat Radio Network on FM 101.2 KRPG.
Welcome to Dungeon Master Diaries, a podcast about Shadowdark and other role-playing games where two GMs talk about their recent or not-so-recent experiences at the table and hopefully give you something useful that you can take to yours. On the show today, we discuss so much good stuff. Hello there, sages and adventurers. The bottom dropped out. My name is Jody, and with me, as always, is my good friend and GM colleague, Matt. What the hell is going on around here?
Honestly, Jody, I don't know, but it's the end of the year, and it's an exciting time. Let's get to it.
Yep, may all of your Yule logs be round and solid. Today's episode is going to focus on a lot of great stuff. Oh, you are in for a ride, folks, including some listener questions and a 2025 reflection. Matt, please take us to the table.
This is like the most ambiguous and opaque beginning of the show of all time, and I would be happy to take you to the table, the proverbial table, Jody. And I think that 2025 has been perhaps one of the best years of my gaming, and it was the first full year of Dungeon Master Diaries, a year that saw the sunsetting of our monthly open table game after a couple of years of monthly play, the rise of your Saturday Salt Marsh games, and the continuation of my long-running Dolmenwood campaign. We have played a lot of Shadowdark and other role-playing games this past year, many of which we have talked about on the program, many sessions and many of those games we've talked about on the program, but not all of them. And I just think, and at this time of year where people are looking back on the year that was and thinking about the year to come, this is when we start to think about, well, what could have been or what might be, Jody? But I think what we're going to do today is really just try and indulge a little bit in the excitement, positivity, and just genuine joy that we've gotten from the hobby over the last year. So let's do that now.
Join us, won't you, as we gather around the fire for a little holiday chat and a year-end special, a reflection, a thought ahead. And to kick this off, the direction we're going to start with is, I think it was great in our to the table moment where you were talking about that kind of reflective part of the year. So we posed a question out to our listeners via Discord, and, it wasn't the way the question was worded, but to a degree it was, hey, what did we miss? We think back on the year, what were those opportunity costs lost? Or doggone it, why won't you guys just talk about this thing? And our listeners didn't let us down, and we got some excellent questions. So let's kick it off with them. First listener question is from Dat Matt. Not you.
No, not me.
Not you. Dat Matt, friend and active participant on the Discord, friend of show. Here we go. We briefly touched on telegraphing as GMs in Discord. And he thinks this would be a good topic for us to cover sometime. What are some effective telegraphing techniques for monsters, traps, what else? And where can it be used to great effect? Matt, this is you, Matt. This is your strength. Of the two of us, I have learned much of what I do from you. So I wanted to ask this question because, well, when I am considering what I do, I go to you. So share your wisdom, Matt.
Well, okay, so one of the things that I'll start with off the top is that when I'm telegraphing almost anything, I try and use senses that I normally don't describe. So, for instance, smell is a great one. I think maybe it was in the previous episode or one of our more recent episodes, you talked about like some troglodytes or something like that, and the players could smell them. And I always think that even if players don't get all of the information when you're telegraphing, I mean, sometimes it's good to give them kind of quote unquote all of the information. A lot of times it's best to kind of hold some things back, make them, make some assumptions and inferences. I like using senses other than sight, because what you see is basically what the GM is always describing. We're always describing what players see. But when you start describing things very specifically about what they smell, about about changes in temperature, about changes in textures, or changes in terms of even things breaking the silence is good. But the more evocative you can be by getting away from sight and sound being a kind of close second to sight, the better, because those are going to trigger responses from players. And then in addition to that, I think making some above table conversation happen of just telling the players, like, your character would know that this is what they're looking at. So those are my kind of two big picture things, and there's a lot more we could talk about with telegraphing, but that's kind of where I'm at.
The second question that Matt threw in there was, where can it be used to affect? This is what I've learned from you. Everywhere. that you cannot over telegraph. I imagine there is a point, because everything is, shades of gray.
Extremes.
But that line for me of when should I telegraph, I was playing way too close to the chest. Jokingly, a night or so ago, you and I were chatting after a meeting, and I quipped about, like, well, I was too subtlety, and you were like, well, subtlety is one of your strengths. And I still don't know if you were being sarcastic or serious, but like, as a GM, I default to subtle way too often, of like, ooh, keep it like realistic and like nuanced. And yeah, the players are going to freaking miss all that stuff. Be obvious about it. Telegraph constantly. Going by a trap, I love all those ideas of smells and things. I'm thinking of years ago, I wrote a dungeon that was like my own attempt at the everything dungeon, which is like, it has all the cliches in it, and there was a methane trap in there of like, you go by some pipes and it smells like decaying matter, and your torch starts flickering. And the torch, that's another great telegraph, is every party's wandering around with a torch in hand. Well, the torch can be the tell. It starts fading. It starts picking up. You mentioned temperature, and I thought that was great, because literally in the last session of Dolmenwood we played, you did a bunch of telegraphing with temperature, and this room got very cold, and then it got very cold, and now it's becoming painfully cold. And lo and behold, the room was problematically caused damage, freeze you to death cold. Eventually it got to that point. I had those same trogs that you just mentioned were literally in our last session, and the players had to like pick different paths, and they started going down one. And I was like, your characters now know this stench well.
Right.
That sour, rotten musk like burns your eyes. You're starting to hear that, and you hear croaking in the shadows ahead. And they were like, whoop, that's not the fight we're looking for. Let's use a different track, because they had the map. And, so those are all, I think, really excellent telegraphing points. And I think you and I have both, specifically to traps. I think monsters in the dark and those things, I think, are a great starting point if you as a GM are like, hey, how do I telegraph more? Start with monsters. Traps, I think, are the much more challenging one. And what I learned from you, and again, I'm just going to keep telling you how amazing you are, is that it's more fun when you know the trap's there. Like the game, traps being a obvious scene challenge, almost like a monster. You know it's there. How do we deal with it? Is frankly more fun and more interesting than wham, you got squished, or oop, you're a thief, now make a dex check to not get squished and everybody else gets squished. You're just rolling dice for the sake of rolling dice. And as the person who is of the two of us, the dice lover, love me to roll them those math rocks. Even I am going, no, just tell people the trap's there, unless the players are so obviously bypassing the telegraphing.
Yeah.
And as you do this more, it feels much better when you do hit your players with a whammy and they go, oh, right.
Well, I think what's nice is when you start telegraphing traps. Let's talk about traps. I think this is a great topic, because each GM needs to figure out how much information they want to give their players and how much information their players need to make decisions, right? Because there are some groups that thrive off of less information and more questions, and there are some groups that are just going to thrive in a more kind of GM gives information up front and gives more prompts to ask questions. And I think that tables can change over time, et cetera, et cetera. But what I like about traps is that they are hard. Like, traps to me are sort of an end game boss for GMs, especially in the world and the water that we swim in with OSR, kind of broadly speaking, games and Shadowdark, where traps and adjudicating traps, both when they go off, what they do, what the mechanism is, disarming traps, disabling traps, etc. It is hard. Like, and people come to the Discord and people, write blog posts about that. I mean, it is a long, a tried and true challenge of being a GM, because for me, and I don't know about you, I find that traps are important, if not necessary, and they are also almost always a situation in which you have to thread a needle of giving just enough information to not feel like you misled your players, and also not too much information to make sure that traps are completely that there's no chance of players tripping a trap, right? And so I'm still on this journey of like trying to figure it out. I still err on more information. It's always nice to have a thief in the group, because I still err on a little bit more front-loaded information prior to asking questions. But I also think that, there are secrets, to kind of give a little hint to one of my favorite things this year. There are things that are hidden and there are things that are secret. And if a trap is secret, or if a secret door is secret, meaning that it is more than just hidden, it's going to take a lot of effort to find, well, then maybe you don't telegraph it at all. And that becomes the kind of crux of my thinking now is, do I want this trap to be something that is truly secret, that like they're going to have to spend a lot of time figuring out and identifying? Or is this more of something that, like, if they just look at the wall, they'll find the secret door, they'll find the trap, or both, or whatever. So to me, there is a great example of this, is the last thing I'll say, of telegraphing traps, is a great image. And essentially it is a door, and then across from the doors is a wall. The door is closed, and on the wall is the outline of a humanoid, and around the humanoid is like a burn mark, right? And this is a great example of telegraphing traps, because you're not telling the players that this door, if they open, it's going to shoot out a gout of flame. And if they can't figure that out, then like that's sort of on the party, but like that's what's going to happen, right? And when they open the door and it shoots out a gout of flame, then oh yeah, okay. So that, I don't know, that's kind of where I am, is finding creative and unique ways to telegraph things is hard. And I don't, no one's going to get it right every time, but it does feel a little bit like an end game, kind of like one of those challenges that we may never be able to master, just because of the diversity of traps and the diversity of things that need telegraphing.
Well, and I think that top point you brought up of, is your play group, are your players the kind of people who are going to be highly procedural and ask lots and lots of questions? And then you can pull back on this telegraphing quite a bit. If your group is not, and I do think this is also classically, at least online, and I think there's some validity to it, of old school versus new school kind of player mentalities. That's a consideration of I think that's really important. For me, one of the really important things in terms of leveling up and thinking about telegraphing, that is one of those, recently on the show, we've talked about some differences of opinion around this notion of party balance.
Yeah.
And I think traps are probably one of the things I still cling to most aggressively, of, if you don't have a thief in your party, then unless you ask as a party exactly the right questions, you're going to get victimized by traps. And I
totally agree with that. I agree with that.
that in my literal last session I ran, they identified a trap and they still got nailed by it. It wasn't terribly unlike the flaming door trap you explained.
I sort of set you up for that.
Yeah. And without getting into the full details of it, it is a wonderful trap and they very thoughtfully dealt with it and it still had effect on them. And literally afterwards, it was lovely to hear two of the players go, damn, we need a thief. And yeah, you're in a dungeon. And it's one of the ways why I think traps are so important is it's one of the ways the thief gets to be really cool. And of the 4 core classes in the book, the thief is the one that the GM has a little bit of work to do to make sure they get their moments. And that can be in how you make rulings or how you do, adjudicate and telegraph traps or don't telegraph traps. There's a lot of room in there, but the GM needs to be mindful. And I can speak as a player right now, as a thief who's in a dungeon and there's been lots of thief things to do. It's incredibly satisfying. It was deeply satisfying in the last game when the party who famously we just blunder through stuff. That is our default mode in our Dolmenwood campaign. And they stopped and went, hey, Lamb, thief, we'll wait for you. Go do what you're doing. Then come into this room and work on this. Then you can go down here and look at, they gave him a to-do list basically of which for this character is perfect. He does really well with to-do lists. He does not do well with free time. So I'm just saying that the telegraphing thing, especially in terms of if you're a GM and you want to think about how to use it to effect, start maybe in terms of traps, thinking about how am I going to interact with a thief versus no thief and how would that be telegraphed differently? And I think you can get a ton of mileage out of that.
All right, so let's move on to a couple of questions, actually, but that both deal with converting modules. We're going to start with Mr. Grimm, Chris Cobb, who asks, could you guys have a discussion about module conversions, either TSR modules or 5e? How do you convert monsters, treasure partial treasure parcel? My goodness, treasure parcels. And what are the gold ratios and how much do you reduce magic items, et cetera, et cetera? So, Jody, I think between the two of us, in terms of converting old modules, you are by far and away the more experienced person. So, I'm gonna tee up here, but I'm gonna give you just the thing that usually comes up on the Discord and other places where people ask questions about converting modules, which is converting or the response that they get, I should say. And I want to hear if you agree with it or not. Usually people come and say, hey, I'm going to run this module. And unless it's like a Dungeon Crawl Classics or something like that, folks will say, hey, I want to run this module. It's an OSE module. It's an old school module or whatever. The response is usually, yeah, just run it as is. And there's not a whole lot of conversion that you need to do other than we can talk about treasure. Have you found it fairly easy to convert modules? Or is there maybe some nuance there that the wisdom of the internet is missing?
I think it's exactly as you said, the nuance is missing. As I've said before, my least favorite answer to a give me advice question is, well, it depends. Unfortunately, there is no way to know if you need to do a bunch of module conversion, in my experience, without really digging into the module. And this is getting to a little bit of an esoteric idea that I feel like you and I have been poking at in our last few episodes of what was the idea behind the module when the person wrote it.
Yeah.
You kind of have to go beyond, are there orcs or are there gelatinous ooze monsters or are there elder ether squiddly spooches? Okay, if that's the case, yeah, you can go grab a copy of Creating and Adapting Monsters for Use in Shadow Dark with Mina Bestiary. See other episode about that. You can go grab a copy of that 1-to-1, port over your monsters, do some treasure adjustment, high five, you're on your way. That assumes a lot of things. And I think this is one of the areas that the OSR, whatever that is, really generally doesn't do a great job, which is like, oh yeah, you can just run it as is. Don't worry about it. Just port over the monsters. You can change the treasure and you're good to go. That's it. What gets missed is the assumption that the person is exclusively going to be running that module in a highly procedural BX style, OSE style of game. that is not exclusively, if we've said it once, we've said it 100 times, and we'll keep saying it. That is not how Shadow Dark exclusively operates. Shadow Dark is incredibly welcoming to all modes of play, and new school, old school, whatever you want to do. So when you want to approach a module conversion, that consideration of what is it that the person who wrote this module was going for is really important to consider. If it is an OSR style or a proper old school module, then yes, you can just convert the monsters, convert the treasure, high five, you're on your way. If it is a newer adventure written in the last 5 years, I think you need to have an understanding of what is this module trying to achieve. Is it a wilderness exploration? Is it a dungeon crawl? Is it a horror and suspense game? Is it a whodunit mystery? Is it, okay, well then you really have to start thinking differently about the conversion and what you're going for, because the lethality levels of Shadow Dark and its monsters don't necessarily match with modern sensibilities. So that's where the monster conversion can get really iffy. If the monsters are there as challenges to be overcome and not things to be avoided, right? Here's maybe a more succinct way of saying this. If the module views combat as a fail state, then it doesn't matter how the monsters are converted because you're supposed to avoid them. If the module was written assuming you will get in combat, then you need to make sure that when you work through the module, the monsters are still balanced.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought of that. I mean, and that sounds to me more sort of 5e, because you were using some of the stuff from the 5th edition Saltmarsh, and I think that's maybe where that's coming from, right? It's because like there's keyed encounters and stuff like that. Yeah. So let me ask you a follow-up question. I want to talk about treasure, because this is something we haven't really talked about on the show, and Chris asks about it, and I have some very strong opinions about treasure in Shadow Dark that not everyone in the community agrees with, but we can maybe get to those if we have time. But how have you found converting treasure? The sort of colloquial and agreed upon wisdom is to divide by 10. There's some math there that checks out by and large. I think I've talked about I can talk about this in the past, that the higher the gold sums, I have found that kind of gets a little wonky. But what has your experience been in terms of specifically treasure? We can talk about like treasure as it pertains to financial benefit, right? Just like pure gold value, and also magic items. Have you found it easy to convert those things? Because in Barrow Maze, I found myself utterly out of my depth in terms of my understanding of how those things would impact the system, and it really, it frankly messed up the game, and so. But I'll give you an opportunity to kind of before I launch into my my diatribe.
Well, I don't think have talked about this maybe recently.
I don't think so.
I don't know if you know that I think both of us have had a huge evolution with how we feel about treasure in Shadow Dark, and there are some very real implications about what treasure does to a Shadow Dark game and what works and what doesn't work. And I think there's some nuance there, as always. I think if you are going to convert a module that was not intentionally written and bespoken for Shadow Dark, which case you wouldn't be converting it, it's ready to run. But if there is any conversion going on, most of your time should be spent on treasure conversion, because Shadow Dark's economy and treasure is really important, and it's much tighter than you think it is.
Yep.
The game is there's a heavy part of an ongoing campaign that the money is really important to having the game operate, air quotes, correctly. There is an assumed thing. If you have listened to our interview with Kelsey, it was kind of a joke question, but also I was genuinely curious about how much money is a year's income. And she had a very succinct answer that basically the value of a large diamond, which you can find in the book, is a year's income, because at that time, very sweetly, she was looking at getting married and buying a ring for her wife, and she needed to look up, it's about a year's salaries to buy a wedding ring. That's kind of the usual math. And so that was the number that was landed on. And that number is pretty important. It turns out, towards the economy of how much does it cost for room.
Do you remember
and
how
board.
much that is off the top of your head?
No, because in my head, I'm
put it in
thinking 365, and that seems too on the nose that it's a gold piece a day. But it basically works out to a gold piece a day is the number that you want to keep in mind.
We'll put it in the show notes document. I'm sure we can go find it. But
I just said something, though, to take it back to the beginning of that ramble.
Yes.
That it sounds terrible. Wait, Jody, you just said if I'm going to convert a module, I should spend most of my time on converting over treasure. And is it divide by 10? And no, and the reason you need to do a heavy conversion is just entirely scrap the treasure that's in the module.
Ooh,
if it says
spicy.
There's like a just stock treasure item, there's some cold coins or whatever, have a number of treasure rolls, full stop. Just use the treasure table and go roll this many on the treasure table, and holy cow, use the XP for treasure results, because then the actual amount of treasure is a lot less important, and you won't screw up your ultimate long-term economy because you're staying within Shadowdark. If a magic item shows up, that's a tougher choice, because if it's a +1 dagger, that works fine in Shadowdark. How many +1 daggers are in this dungeon is a thing you want to consider. There's also some really cool pros and cons, weapons with personalities or features and drawbacks that you and I have been dabbling with pretty heavily. I don't think dabble is even really fair anymore. We have been using weapons and things that have not necessarily personalities that'll talk to you, but they have their purpose becomes clear if you start wielding the weapon. It isn't just a sword that's extra sharp. It has an agenda of its own, and it will start wanting you to do those things, drive you to combat. I have a weapon that was forged by a dwarven smith in his fight against orcs that ultimately took his home, and one of my characters found the sword, and hey, every time orcs show up, I keep telling him, like, you feel an urge to go after them. You feel he has acquiesced and just played into it. I am waiting for the moment when he tries to hold back. I am very excited for that.
Well,
so
yes,
what I mean by converting is if you're using a non-Shadowdark produced module, non-arcane library module or otherwise, just treasure. You need to flop everything to random table rolls and then really consider your magic items. All right, rant over. What you got? What's your spicy takes?
I think you kind of just took my rant.
Oh, sorry.
So I appreciate it. I have felt the same way. There have been a couple times where I've had to kind of come back from the brink in our Dolmenwood game, because there have been a couple of magic items that I didn't think about converting beforehand, and I think the thing that you said that really kind of hangs, or at least for me, kind of sticks in my craw about the treasure stuff, is that so many people are focused on gold piece value and not sort of how the game sees treasure. Because in BX modules, and sort of TSR modules, etc., there was an assumption that you were going to bring that gold piece value back to town, and that was how you got experience. But in Shadowdark, because experience is just gained in the moment, and you can add on you have to take it back to town. It's totally reasonable. But because it isn't divide up the treasure and you get experience equal to gold piece value of divided treasure, your retainers take a share, et cetera, et cetera. Like, because it doesn't involve that level of kind of granularity, what happens is that you can start getting into a situation where your experience is fine, but your gold piece values, the amount of money that your characters have, is just totally out of whack with what the game assumes you're going to spend money on. Which, like, one of the flaws of Shadowdark's core rules, in my opinion, one of the very few kind of glaring issues, is downtime. Like, I like the downtime rules because I like homebrewing and house ruling and doing a bunch. But per the book, there aren't that many good gold sync opportunities. The gear list becomes relatively irrelevant, and you max out on slots before you run out of money. Especially if you're a wizard,
yeah,
right. And carousing is fun, but like as soon as you kind of pop the hood on carousing, you start realizing that, like, man, just spending 30 gold on carousing is actually a much better option, because you're not getting a lot for your money, except the kind of the flavor of and like that isn't, even for our group, that's not too far. You don't have to be one of those min-maxy kind of players to see that eventually. Like you sort of start looking at it and you're like, why are we spending so much money? Anyways, my big problem was money and money entering the kind of internal game economy and world economy. And I've gotten away with it in our Dolmenwood game by facilitating gold sinks for you guys narratively that made sense, but also were definitely me trying to pull the economy back. And I think we're now at a place where like I've gotten it back in balance, but there was a point where it was out of whack. Like you guys had too much money for where you were. The other thing is that magic items, especially magic weapons and especially magic items like spell books can if you're not careful be also fairly destabilizing. If you give a wizard a spell book, first of all, it's awesome, but the spell books also have like sometimes 4 spells in there, and wizards can use a day basically to just make a check to try and learn a spell and then cast that spell, forever, right? So being careful about the treasure means understanding how the treasure that you're giving interacts with the other systems in the book. And the thing that I want to kind of point out is gold piece values. Be very careful. Dividing by 10 is great for gold piece values, but it is not necessarily a cure-all. High gold piece values, 3,000 gold, I think need to be more heavily divided and reduced. I'll put a link to some math that Gels did on this, and dividing by 10 is great. But for me, the other big issue is specifically plus to spellcasting. Anything that gives advantage on spellcasting or anything that gives wizards or spellcasters more power, especially wizards, and then also things that give extra damage and extra attack bonuses that. Because fighters and wizards eventually become so consistent in their ability to hit and their ability to cast spells built into their class. This is a class feature that being careful of that stuff early on is important. This goes hand in hand with our feelings about buffing spell casting and why we don't feel like that's a good idea. So unfortunately, I don't think we can really dig into this. This might be a whole episode in and of itself and talk about treasure. But those are the kinds of things that I would pay attention to: your internal economy, gold piece value, things that are going to buff spellcasters, and things that are going to give extra significant damage bonuses to fighters.
I want to real quick, if I can, jump in there.
No, of course.
Careful with spell books. Hooray for scrolls.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that distinction is important, that giving spellcasters, wizards, a scroll, very cool, because there's a choice to be made there. A whole spell book and you can just learn them, that's a whole different thing. Fun little side note on this before we move on.
Yeah.
5e modules, the treasure in those is the most one-to-one portable that I've found, which I think is fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
That it's not OSR, old TSR stuff. Ooh, some heavy lifting to do there. 5e modules, pretty darn close, which is funny for the game that doesn't need treasure other than what's my coolest magic item. But the actual treasure, like gold and gem and item values, are pretty on the nose. I don't have to usually monkey with them too much. If you're all right with it, I want to push on to the next question, because I was elated when this question came across, especially because of how it segued into some discussion that was happening on the Discord. So Noise Jokey, Nathan Moody, thank you, sends us, what sources, all caps, outside of the fantasy genre most shape your plot and character ideas in your Shadowdark campaigns? And my friend genuinely felt my heart warmed at this question, and then you've had a recent realization about, if you will, your Appendix N, which obviously has the fantasy genre, but this notion that we talked about on the show not long ago of no player comes to an RPG blank slate without reference points. So I was very excited to ask you this question on the show to kind of give you a first time in your own light, maybe thinking or sharing out your, like, here are my, and again, this was outside of the fantasy genre, but some of your touchstones, and I want you to touch on the fantasy touchstones for you as well, because when we first started gaming, you're like, man, I'm not like a Tolkien guy, and I didn't.
Sure.
So, and you had some angst about that, I'll say.
I still do, although because I do feel like so much of fantasy is angled at a very particular kind of slice of the pie, and whatever you want to call it, kind of generic fantasy land of D&D is a very specific thing and not something that I am familiar with. So that's why I've sort of glommed on to Dolmenwood so much, and I've had this realization that my Appendix N for fantasy stuff is largely born out of folk tales and fairy tales. Some of my favorite films are Miyazaki films, and some of my favorite genres are like folk horror and high weirdness, or at the very least like sort of supernatural stuff. I'm not really into high fantasy. I'm not into like those hard magic systems like the Brandon Sanderson's kind of. I am much more in the vein of I just love anything that is my favorite. My way I would describe this is that my personal favorite genre is disquieting fiction. Any fiction that makes you feel like things are not quite right. I've been rewatching the first season of True Detective, which is perhaps my favorite piece of television media I've ever seen. And it has like some great, these aren't spoilers, but it has some great nods to supernatural horror. And like, it's just, that stuff wasn't immediately sort of visible to me. And I also didn't necessarily know that I wanted it from my fantasy role playing. But when I found Dolmenwood, and when I have found subsequently like lots of other modules, I'm not really into survival horror. I don't really like the Morkborg or however you say it. Like that stuff is too. It's not disquieting. It's very obvious that everything sucks. When one of the weapon pages is a freaking femur bone, right? That's not subtle enough for me. You're talking about, subtlety. Like, so my Appendix N is that stuff is Miyazaki. It's even, like Zelda, but like I always enjoyed I didn't really enjoy the puzzly part of Zelda. I enjoyed like Zelda Link's Awakening, which is this really weird, very different than like normal Zelda game where you're like trapped in a dream. Like I love that stuff. And then you couple that with the fact that I also love this kind of horror element of folk horror and stuff. And then the game I probably played that's the closest to traditional D&D is probably Diablo 2. And even, those vibes are very sort of demonic focused, and you're not fighting demons at level 1 in a D&D game, right? So the idea of fighting goblins and going into a cave, like that was novel when we played Lost Mines of Phandelver. Like I was like, oh, there is a cave here that I might explore with goblinoids in it. This was novel for me.
Hey, those little suckers set an ambush. What the hell?
Right. Well, like, and I think what I was feeling was a sense of like, oh, I don't have any way of anticipating what may or may not happen, or I don't have any way of feeling like I am capable of setting expectations, or interpreting information that is being delivered to me, because I don't have all these like assumptions about like what a goblin is like, or what a traditional medieval fantasy realm is like. So that's a long answer, but I'll put a proper Appendix N in. I didn't want to build one because I sort of hate when people just list off their Appendix Ns, and I kind of wanted to just do it off the cuff, because I think more so it's interesting to hear the outcome of an Appendix N rather than just like see the sources. But I'll put a list in the show notes. Now, Jody, what is your Appendix N, or if not an Appendix N, you can do what I did and just kind of ramble for like 5 minutes.
I wish I could so eloquently and interestingly. I enjoy it, and I'm sitting here. So I just am stoked. I'm going to keep gushing over this, that however it came to be that you got some validation of that your experiences and the fact that it's not goblins in a cave and orcs are bad is still valid. That's still your experience. And what it prompted me to look at was, yes, I am a Tolkien fan and have been for a long, long time, though I did start my fandom with the animated Rankin Bass versions thereof and Bashki. But
that's a nerd flex.
Nice, a little bit. Played. Oh, thanks. I'm proud of it. So outside the fantasy genre, there is a thing that I cannot put my finger on entirely the why. I'm going to try here. That is foundational. And I think it has to do with my age and that my parents are comedically, and I love them and they're good humans, but boomers in the proper boomer sense. So the old cowboy Western flicks were just there. They were just around. I am of an age that when I was a kid, I literally had the experience of being told, well, you're the youngest, so you have to be the Indian while we play cowboys and Indians in the highly problematic way. We're talking very early 80s here and being, man. Sure. That Western, spaghetti Western. Yeah. My dad was a big Louis L'Amour novel reader. And he reads, but not a ton. But that was a thing that there was always a shelf of those. I don't remember watching Westerns as a kid. I don't remember reading anything. But there was something about that frontier lone gunsman. The heroes get together to save the village or the Western town, or that whole concept is intensely influential in my fantasy and Shadow Dark play. There is that element is really not extractable, and it's shaped things that again, it's weird that it has this much of an influence on all of my RPG playing, just because I was never into that stuff. I was never I'm a cowboy ranching guy, even though I grew up in a community that was very much those things and was around it. So it influenced me really indirectly. So it's been weird to see in there. Also in this notion of what's outside of the fantasy genre for me is X-Men, specifically X Factor of the very early 90s. And you have to be kind of a comic book nerd to know why that's important. It is post Chris Claremont where the X-Men became a soap opera, I will say. And I just made some listeners really mad. And that the X-Men with Wolverine and there was a lot of very thoughtful social commentary going on. X Factor was this very Gen X. We were pushed down by the man, and then we were kind of legitimized as mutant hunters, but we're actually secretly reprogramming them and anti-establishment, and they are superheroes. And that notion of a superhero that is anti-establishment but has to play within the system to be anti-establishment, that is pervasive in my RPG experience. That notion of heroics that would fit into those two kind of milieu, super important. And lastly, that's probably the most obvious thing we've talked about here, the Alien films.
Oh, dude, I mean, for me as well.
Right. This is where you and I go, I see what you're doing there.
Yep.
Is the first, I'll just say all of them, even 3. All the kind of original mainline Alien films.
You're going to include 3 in there. All right.
There's some good stuff in 3 from an RPG standpoint. There's some excellent stuff in 3 from it's a movie and it's part of the canon. A high five. It sure is. Yeah. So the Alien film, for a kid who was terrified of horror movies and horror genre stuff, but would look at my oldest brother's newly released Iron Maiden album covers with morbid fascination, and was also kind of scared of them. That stuff's my jam. So that's that dark piece, I think, is that dark fantasy and kind of grossness.
You want to talk about telegraphing? Alien is, the original Alien is you want to study in telegraphing. I mean, I have lots of feelings about monster movies that show you the monster too early and why after you see them. Anyways, this is why I think Stranger Things season 1 is great and the rest of the seasons are mediocre, is because we already saw the Alien. Anyways,
you said that, not the Stranger Dark thing. We can move past that hot take. The Alien, and I immediately just started hearing boop, boop, boop.
I mean,
boop in my head. I was like, oh my God, telegraphing.
It's so good. So I'm sure both of us will put like a list in the show notes of just of fun stuff. And I think that the fun thing about appendix ends is that you make them and then you look back on them and you're like, how did I miss this thing? So, I would love to hear listeners recommend us stuff, like if you have disquieting fiction, like the Southern Reach series, like Annihilation, give me recommendations, because I don't know. I find myself in this place of newly I'm encouraged.
Yeah.
Because I feel like there is a place for me in this hobby, which sounds weird because of course there's a place for everybody, but like you said, Jody, it has taken me years to feel like I found an avenue where I can run games and feel confident that I'm providing a fantasy story, but doing it in a way that feels at least authentic to what I enjoy as far as like what the fiction has to offer. So
on this note, and it is fantasy related, but I listened to Sabriel by Garth Nix, which when Kelsey was on said was one of her touchstones.
It was the inspiration for the Necromancer class.
Totally. And boy, is it. And holy cow, listening to that book, I was like, oh, there's some things I genuinely understand better about Shadowdark and how it works because I've listened to this book. So in terms of Appendix N, and we all come from places and we all have perspectives, it was really neat to read that with the express thought of, do I see any Shadowdark in this? And it was like, 20 minutes in and I was like, yes. Oh, yes, I see Shadowdark. There is oh my goodness, I get some things. Anyway, the Appendix N is always fun, and I agree with you. It's way more fun when you can have the like, what was your touchstone piece? I think that's always the jam. Let's get into some little bit rapid fire here instead of some questions. Listeners, as always, I'm going to plug it in one plug before we get into this bullet list. If you've got questions, join us on the Discord. I mean, we say it at the end of every show, but again, we love doing these. It's a little bit self-indulgent, so we don't do it all the time, but we do love having that opportunity to talk about the things you've shared with us. All right, Matt, top line takeaways, best stuff from this year, 2025, favorite stuff, go.
All right, so we combed through our extensive show notes document in which I found that some links may be dead, but we pulled our favorite stuff. So I'm just going to rattle off my top 3 favorite things that we talked about, and that I'm still kind of looking back in fondness. The first one is from our Dungeons and Designs episode, which is the DIY and Dragons landmark hidden secret method. I'm using it currently in this dungeon that I'm running you all through, this like 40-room dungeon for Dolmenwood that I designed, and I used this method to design the various elements of the rooms, and it was very powerful. The second thing is Kids on Bikes 2nd edition and Tales from the Loop, which remains, outside of Shadowdark, probably my best gaming experience of the last year. And then the third and final thing is I completely changed my dice setup this year to basically exclusively use the ICRPG dice set, the troll molars, if you will. And that was largely based on the GM dice and almost exclusively based on the fact that I like to have a uniform set of dice. And that set happened to come with a die that I was excited about, but I didn't realize was going to fundamentally change the way I do things, which is the yes-no die. Hie thee hence to get to any place that sells you a 50-50 yes-no die. Get yourself a decider die. I mean, they're great. And it's weird. It is weird how much better they are than rolling a D6 and looking at a number. I know that sounds weird, but psychologically, for me, it's just much more impactful, and I think it's fun.
Okay. I will say, every time you toss that particular yes-no molar, I watch our whole player group lean in.
Yeah.
There is something to that. I have started using the decider die over myself.
What are your 3 favorite things? Oh my God. I just looked at your list and I love this.
Okay. So my first thing is definitely from 2025. It's N2. The Forest Oracle from TSR, the worst module ever, was, I think, the episode title.
Yeah.
This is an old classic module with all of the questions we get about converting adventures. Man, I think this one is worth a look. There is some problematic stuff that is heavily dated about the representation and use of the term gypsies. you can reskin that in a heartbeat and move forward with anything else. Frankly, it can just be bandits. It doesn't need any sort of now problematic term for very problematic and obvious reasons. So I think the Forest Oracle is great in terms of, I want a plug and play, try this out adventure. I think it offers a lot of opportunities for seeing what Shadow Dark does well. If you want to play it in old school style, I don't agree with the many lambasting reviews of it. That's partly why it's on my list, is the discordance between the experience we had, which was absolutely lovely, and damn, I wish I'd scheduled more sessions with this module.
I know. I wish we could go back and play it all over again.
Yeah. And it being like, oh, this is the worst module ever. And I'm like, no, there is so much good stuff. And again, just to keep beating the telegraphing drum, it tells your players what to do and where they should go to do it. That's not railroading, that's direction. They're two different things. Anyway, so yes, the very new from 1982, if I'm remembering correctly, N2, the Forest Oracle, really enjoyed that. Was a lovely gaming experience. And I don't know many modules I come back to that I'm like, oh my gosh, how do I figure out a way to run this again? Next up is a guest of the show and a resource that I have used constantly. It is now tidily or neatly wedged into my Shadow Dark rulebook, because when I grab one, I want the other, is from Night Noon Games, creating and adapting monsters for use in Shadow Dark RPG with mini bestiary. It's just a plethora of great ideas, resources, and framing. It is a great, I need something on the fly. Here's a quick conversion table. I have an unexpected monster. I want it to be level 3. Boom, I'm good, go. And it's just a distillation of all that is good in Shadow Dark. So that one, full props to that. And lastly is the meadery mishap that we talked about from Dawn Fist Games. I think as a introduction to Shadow Dark module, a ready-to-play Shadow Dark built adventure, because it was written for use with Shadow Dark, I haven't seen anything else that has both been as enjoyable to use as a product and been as successful, frankly, at the table. I have said many times and have limited experience, it's on my next year to-do list, is the Minotaur, the Curse of the Minotaur maze thing there, the default adventure that everybody, the Curse of the Scarlet Minotaur. So I need to run that, but every time I read it and talk to people, the experience they're sharing with me is not the bespoke Shadow Dark experience I want. The meadery mishap is that. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It is a product from 2025, and get that into people's hands and continue to go, hey, if you're looking for where do I start, man, this is a great spot, because it can be 1 session to 5 sessions and lots of different styles and things to do.
I do like that you're just trolling people by not saying the correct name of the Lost Citadel of the Scarlet Minotaur. And
I didn't say that in any of the takes.
It's unclear to me whether or not you actually know the name of the dungeon, because you have been such a contrarian about it. And
I got to hang my hat somewhere.
I understand that, but it is slightly offensive to both me and everyone else. But Jody,
I'll take the hate mail.
Let's take a break. Let's hear from a sponsor, and then we'll get back to close out the show. This episode is brought to you by Magic Mouth Audiobooks, because reading with your eyes is for scholars and suckers. Let's face it, between dungeon delving, torch juggling, and fending off swarms of knife-wielding goblins, who has time to read anymore? That's where Magic Mouth Audiobooks comes in. Just slap on a rune-inscribed gem onto your temple and let the disembodied voice do the reading for you. They've got a vast library of over 10,000 books. That's almost all the books in the world, including such famous classics as 50 Shades of Fae, The Necromancer's Cookbook, and To Kill a Basilisk. Magic Mouth has something for every adventurer, scholar, and necro-curious teen. Jody, you have been reading via Magic Mouth audiobooks. And I know you're not much of a reader normally. But boy, howdy, have you been churning through some tomes.
You know, you wouldn't think it would work, but coloring books in this medium are outstanding. They've never been more vivid, and they even somehow got the crayon smell in there. I can smell them. It's so lovely. We gather around the campfire, Cookie gets the pot going, and man, I just sit there with some dandelions and some crayons. And man, it's so great.
Not quite sure how it works, but I'm going to check that out, Jody. So you can sign up today, as I will be, using code Whispers in the Walls. Not creepy at all. For a free trial and 1 complimentary tome of Tomes and Tentacles. Just be careful. Some narrators have opinions and may try and correct your spell casting as they read. Magic Mouth audiobooks. Feed your mind. Terrify your ears.
Alrighty, let us bring this topic into the light, but that's a little problematic because, well, we already gave here's our top takeaways from 2025. So, well, if every coin has 2 sides, then every year has a beginning and an end, and then it does
turn
again. There it is. So what are we looking forward to for next year? And I think this is really interesting in terms of, we just talked about cool products and things we enjoyed, and then what we're looking forward to in 2026 is an entirely different set of things. So go ahead, Matt.
I'm looking forward to concluding our Dolmenwood campaign, not because I feel like it needs to end because I'm getting tired of it at all, but because I do want to try new things in that group. And I also want to talk about this sort of final dungeon delve through this dungeon that I designed and put a lot of effort and work into. And I think that teardown episode that we do, whenever it happens, is going to be I think it will be useful in terms of kind of coming full circle on doing a dungeon design episode and then doing kind of a dungeon teardown and talking through my experience designing a dungeon that is of a reasonable size. And the only other thing that I want to do is I'm going to announce it here. I want to run a reasonably long-term or long-term-ish open table, semi-open table on the Shadowdark Discord. I want to start running games online. I want to run some of these Shadowdark modules that we haven't really been able to get into. Or I may just say screw it and start running a Dolmenwood game campaign on.
I think you have some experience with that.
I do.
I'm going to piggyback that in a different non-digital format. And if you've listened for any amount of time, you will get why that is kind of a joke. Because, yeah, me and digital, go figure. I'm really excited for the Western Reaches physical products to come and be delivered in hand so I can figure out what I want to do with them, what we want to do with them. I want to do something with them other than just purely have them as objects. I am excited to use them as that continues to be the calling card of Shadowdark. So for next year, whenever those products land in hand, my goodness, am I just ready to have them? And it's hard for me to digest and use rules online. So this is very excited to see what games come from the products therein. And man, I feel you so much on that concluding your Dolmenwood campaign. And this is my last takeaway is I am so excited for my next campaign or my next campaign location or my next campaign game. And on some level feeling like, why can't I just be happy with what I have? But it's not a ready to move on. I love what I'm doing now, but there's always so many more cool ideas. And I can't wait to see what comes to light in the year ahead. As the torchlight grows dim, we hope you're able to find something useful in this episode that you can take into a future game. If you have any questions or unique experiences like the one you heard on the show today that you'd like to share with us, email us at dmdiariespod. You can also reach out on YouTube or Facebook or get at us on the Dungeon Master Diaries thread on the Shadowdark Discord channel. That's where it goes down. You can find links to those feeds and any of the materials we referenced, so many materials we referenced in this episode's show notes. And until next time, I hope this year was lovely, and I hope next year is even freaking better.
Dungeon Master Diaries is a production of the Stingbat Radio Network. It's produced by Jody Kropholler and edited by Matt Bruner. Our intro and outro music is composed by Christian Schuster, and Dungeon Master Diaries is an independent production. It's not affiliated with the Arcane Library LLC. Shadowdark RPG is a product of the Arcane Library. Copyright 2023. Boom. 2026, here we come.
Take it.
You know? It's gonna be a good year. Why won't you just read a PDF?
It makes me sad. It just doesn't stick. Like it, I don't know.